it's lovely to see you. The vicissitudes of well, of my life and of trying to get everything onto the screen of this very tiny laptop means I can sort of see the bottom of my face. Uh, I'm speaking from a small town outside of Girona in Catalonia, which is I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I thought as I was reading this, and I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, is that almost anything, almost everything that I kind of came across or noticed seemed to start to be relevant to this book. And I was thinking that actually Anthony Varney Capildeo has been in many ways kind of a fact of life for a long time. I mean, their first book came out in 2003, and so it's difficult for somebody, especially someone with a short memory such as myself, to imagine a time when they weren't kind of significant and present and visible. So part of that means that I'll keep the sort of technical introductions to a minimum. The things I'd like to highlight here and the things that they have highlighted about Polkadot Wounds um, is that it's a book about place and about engaging with things, looking at things, and then moving away from them and seeing um, what sort of notions and ideas are generated from them. Um, and that I think is something that I'm finding, the more I read it, the more fascinating I find, and the more um, generative I find it. I think that there are a number of poems that I've come back to, I've come to and come back to again and again in the course of this of reading and having had the very generous opportunity to present Anthony Varney Capildeo's work this afternoon, where I've seen things and then seen things come again, and they're poems that work in, I mean, as with much of their work, they're poems that work in a number of different angles and point you in different directions. I just wanted very briefly to mention a couple of things that I've noticed, and then talk about kind of the uh, Capildeanization of the world, which happens. Um, so, I mean, there are a couple of poems that are going to be read this evening that I just wanted to draw attention to or think about. One of which is called Black Ice, which is very clearly a poem about black ice, and then ends with an absolutely kind of astonishing turn that I hadn't really, you hadn't really seen coming, because this is sort of, I mean, it's a poem about black ice and ice that refreezes and ice that's invisible and ice that kind of engages with certain things. And then there's a series of metaphors, the ways in which, which this can be seen. And it ends, but is not melting, even here, black means invisible, uh, which opens this up to a whole new way of rereading and rethinking and re-entering into the world of the poem right from the start. And I think, maybe we'll talk about this later, but this idea of a poem as something that um that you read in one way and then kind of pulls you in another way, or I mean, pulling seems slightly an aggressive way of doing this. I mean, there are poems that invite you to fall over in a particular direction, and then you stand up again like one of those wobbly chumbawamba toys, and then you fall over again in a slightly different direction, which, speaking as somebody who writes poetry, is something I find technically astonishingly versatile and generative and really interesting to go with. And equally, I mean, not just that, not just sort of on the level of locution and the level of the use of syntax and use of sort of the way in which the syntax leads us in different directions, but also kind of the other environments that we're invited into. So the other poems I was really sort of wanted to mention is this beautiful poem called Steal This, which begins, I mean, even the title is kind of suggesting things, it riffs a little bit on maybe Abby Hoffman's Steal This book, this kind of, 1970s manifesto, but then it's Steal This and it stops there halfway through and you think, steal this, steal this poem that's going to follow. But then it's a poem that's about various forms of appropriation. I mean, I read it I first read it when there was articles in, further articles in the news about more scandals at the British Museum, and not just the stuff that had been, the stuff that had been stolen being restolen by the corrupt curator and sold on eBay. But then, I mean, as again, kind of the perennial discussion of what can be put into a museum. And it just seems entirely aware at the level of language and the level of kind of these very discreet but very pointed little verbal locutions that it has. So it says at some point, you skinned her with one glance and saw you were one blood, you and she, which is, the famous line from the Jungle Book where, the way in which Mowgli can kind of save himself. He calls out, we be of one blood, ye and I. And the idea of bringing in, that sort of imperialist language, or I mean, not necessarily imperialist language, but language from Kipling, who's been identified as often criticized as embodying the imperialist viewpoint, and then taking, twisting it again another way. I mean, it's difficult to sort of overstate how much I enjoyed this book, which I think is, not unexpected, but I didn't expect to, I expected to enjoy it, but to expect to kind of have it as a transformative experience is very, I feel very lucky indeed to have had the chance to read it. And now I think you're going to be very lucky to hear some poems from it. So I'll stop there because that was, I think that's all the warm up. All the crowd has now been kind of pushed into a frenzy, and I'd sort of open the stage to Anthony Varney Capildeo.
Hello, and thank you so much to Coconut, and thank you very much, James. I'm never able to reflect critically on my own poems, partly because when I think about them, I still have my head in the middle of them, and I don't really find ways to say everything that they can say, and I often rather wish that people would simply read rather than expect me to say what I think I meant. You've said much better than me what the poems mean, so thank you for that. Should I just get on to the reading, but first say that it's called Polkadot Wounds because it took shape in Cypress Well in Launceston, Cornwall, former capital of Cornwall. And Cypress Well is the cottage where the late poet Charles Causley lived, and it's possible to stay there on a writer's retreat. It's got the most extraordinary atmosphere and a piano. And there's the statue of the local martyr, St. Cuthbert, Maine, in a beautiful honey-coloured wood in the local Roman Catholic church, with the wounds of his martyrdom sort of poker burnt onto him. And if your eyesight is as bad as mine, it flickers between wounds and polka dots. And I started thinking about it as letting the light in, and I started reading the recycled stones of the castle, priory, and village in a similar way, in terms of wounded buildings, inhabitation, and letting in the light. So, summer, Launceston, St. Cuthbert, Maine, where stone runs like honey, because the sea is a type of desert, spine of self-stripping thorns, now being ruined. Warming to you, I let in the light. You rose stem, long ago, newly dead and risen. Treasure what you say, because nobody's real face exists yet. Polkadot wounds, where stone runs like honey. The slightly odd form of this is because I was asked to do visual artwork for the reopening of the Norman castle called Castle Terrible by popular superstition after its Well, you can guess why. And this text is the middle of two images, and one shows the tiny, very beautiful, sort of vivid green, juicy pennywort growing out of the detail of the ruined castle stones, and the other shows the detail of the honey-coloured wounds. Full circle bells for Leila Capildeo. Mama, I'm swimming down 3 flights of stairs in green light. You can't hear me yet. The tree I'm walking past has put on ocean airs. Up 2 more flights, I can't hear for the bells, cathedraling connection, visible to invisible world embrace. The box sits blackly on the landing wall. I box, you're too high up. A gecko on the stairs, my body stretches, flattens, visible to students who go home, not phone home. Tree doesn't sound submarine to them. No bells, no whistles, hum and buzz, press on their airs. No bloody privacy. So put on airs they can't translate. Hola, dígame, box, can I get home on this line? Riding bells, the idea of earthquakes shatters up the stairs. Whales dive, chew through cable. Wind struck, a tree snaps wires. Numbers make you visible. I dial them, the dirty and visible, but grotty to my fingernails. Coined airs join bells, hojas rojas, singe the frosty tree. I flatten like a gecko to the box for a collect call. Dios, cuantas stairs. America's one south, submarine cable, bells. Drink purpling Virginia creeper, bells are more than bread. Mira what's visible till it compounds and vanishes. Your stairs are an island full of twangling airs. Sway and speak your heart into a box. Your mother's voice is leafing like a tree. While leaves are falling from the ocean tree, you must pass from the way to bells that tick 5 hours apart. A telephone box is a time zone box. You're a visible time traveller, but give yourself no airs. Chiquita, they're drunk rowers on the stairs. 1990s Victorian stairs, your voice held in my hand, mine thinned by airs, my dusk your noon, only the time box visible. That was commissioned by Sarah Jackson for her Crossed Lines telephony project. And on to the next. This was commissioned by Polly Atkin, who I believe is in the audience tonight, for some of her amazing and generously conceived Dorothy Wordsworth response work. And this looks into the idea of crip time, or the perception and experience of time as different in disability and or so-called illness. She wants fire even in the summer, for Polly Atkin. Sometimes a road is a major event, a walk endures more than a calendar. April, January, February, March, chest full of bluebells, breath a wet black bough. March, March, marriage a stage petition. Spring, again you love, sawing me in half. Coughing up fur balls, a wealth of wool. May rewilds me, foaming, I mouth May, a wolf. Summer bestows few vows. December comes as June's bare effigy. A month, a tooth falls out, jaws of the year breathing bluebells, giblet pies. I can write or talk, not both. Should July have held hands with September? August overdosed on June. Sun enough in my marrow for wet stockings to do for entire weeks of June. Each breath a word chesting up from the inky desk of heaviness. October was 1 month or 3, I tell you. November a road. My feet set down December. Crip times betrothed. And the only footnote we'll say to that is if you read Dorothy Wordsworth diaries, so far from being the sort of groupie of the more famous male romantics, she's a lot wilder than Kate Bush. Beware. Next one. This is obviously a response to Dante Alighieri's Commedia, which has been obsessing me as it obsesses many poets, but it's also commissioned by somebody I've forgotten, but it's in the back of the book. Sorry, I'm jet lagged, having come back from Peru on a necessary work trip. Inferno, one size fits most. I mention the necessary work trip because I stand in solidarity, of course, with Fossil Free Books' aims of divestment from fossil fuels and opposition to genocide. I'm not just randomly hopping planes to Peru, or indeed London, every other week. Inferno, one size fits most. Mr. Alighieri, I'm curious. Who cleaned your shoes when you got back from hell? What brand are they, and how hard are your soles? You stampeded through the bitter wormwood. At least a twig, if not a yellow flower, must have stuck. You were super unsure about your footing. That's why you give us instructions how to steady our feet. I wonder, sometimes on your way you fell asleep. I understand you slept in hell. I've almost done that. With your drastic drop and pass out, you're like someone taking cover from natural catastrophes, drop and hold on. The good interpreters come pigeoning, they nod. That sleep's a trance. That one's rapture. This time he's in celestial ecstasy. No, no. Even in hell you were being repaired. Did a blue-silver angel bend lower than earthward, feathering footwear smooth and clean for you? Did the temperature changes help with the dirt? Steam treatment in the adulterer's swirl. An ice rinse later. Anyway, he stepped up, saw the stars again. You're saved, so you don't have a ghost. That sigh at my shopping mall anxiety is Virgil's shade, perhaps, kit list in hand, summed up in one word: follow. You swapped out that list for one word: love. I want to know, Mr. Alighieri, who cleaned your shoes? And which nameless guest forgot his jacket in my pinewood wardrobe? Many people stayed while I was away. I'm wearing it. Scarlet leaves are crawling from my pockets. Black ice. This actually happened. I fell down some staircases in York, which is a beautiful city, and I strongly recommend you visiting it with better shoes than I was wearing. And I treat this at more length in an online non-fiction piece that I wrote for the Poetry on the Move Festival in Canberra. Black ice. These nights the ice melts, but the ice is not melting. These nights it has been raining overnight, but the ice is not melting. These nights the ice melts, but the dawn refreezes the streets. Not melting. Ice, please shine. Please spangle. This ice very does not. Ice, and staircase becomes a failing. Spine and spangle, something moves. Staircases are falling. Noctilucent piano keys, loose teeth, Sardinian cheese walking, as living a feeling of falling, staircased failing. These nights honeycomb, laying down a glaze, I gaze from several angles. The ice melts, but is not melting. Even here, black means invisible. Put out the light. Obviously, that's from Othello, about which I wrote a couple of non-fiction pieces for PN Review, but it's talking about a performance by Joshua Lucci Kong, who 3D printed a copy of the Greyfriars Church in Trinidad, which was unnecessarily partly demolished, and had belonged to the Franciscans, who very much promoted the abolition of slavery. And there's really very little reason that these historical monuments and places are being demolished. And he adapted a traditional masquerade costume and wore the 3D printed church as his headpiece. Put out the light. Hold on to your handkerchiefs, especially embroidered. I misremembered it as after the earthquake he 3D printed the cathedral for a headpiece to play his mass. But no, it was after commercial demolition, partially accomplished, of anti-slavery Greyfriars, Trinidad's landmark. The masquerader handcrafted a model Greyfriars to midnight his protest in festival sun. I misremembered how this guy carried church on his head. It literally happened. They appointed judges who awarded points. Christ have mercy, who was among them? Nobody. I myself. Steal this. My tiny hippopotamus, bandog, or lost species was not mislabeled as a ritual object, unlike the broken combs, cosmetic jars, and other inexplicable mystery discards tweezed from their floodplain or festival-skirted magma tombs. It was labelled as a toy, but for 4,000 years nobody has played with it. And when the woman knocked at your side door in the house with no front door, you skinned her with one glance and saw you were one blood, you and she. But her people earliest had left the floodplain and the festival-skirted magma tombs, where yours wintered and mantraed, deserting much longer after every each day and after the day tomorrow. That is how it is counted. I am 6 years old plus 4,500 years. When she quickly changed the price of her cloth wares and refused to cross your threshold, there were no more toys, only glass for a few thousand years. Your notes danced in her hand and she despised you in her heart. But my reddy-orange toy, which has a happy face, is looking up. I don't mind if you break it. Don't worry about anything. Don't worry. Let's play. It's a little animal from Harappa. If you don't know about the Harappa civilization, I'm sure there are people like Fawzia Kane and Michael Schmidt in the chat who can enlighten you. I'm going to pass on a lot of questions this way. Next one, please. Without armor. A race is happening across the field. Its course involves caravans, horses, 3 king queens, real camels, linen and bleached canvas. Did I come out without my armor? A race is happening. Someone in white, attached by his heels, dragged by a chariot, half on the ground, body and robes pulled along, looks full-faced towards us. He is laughing. Is this a violence and part of the race? Winner in white. In the thick of the crowd he laughs, as if dragged and winning. They are laughing with him. He's on his feet, an El Greco crescent, down again, an El Bosco fluorescent. What is this race? Small amounts of time enter everywhere. Small amounts of time everywhere. Rosewood answers. You can see this painting in Toledo Cathedral. Whatever you're doing, stop when the stranger arrives. Give them lime juice, something cold to drink, somewhere to ease their probably filthy feet. Know you internalize many such sayings, as your ceiling must internalize moths, cobwebs, stain blossom, and immortel seed. Youth. Every each day best. Bring up the girl without pink, says Princess Daddy. Eat roticity chicken. Resist transgressive dickery. That's actually a collage poem from things I was saying together with the family in Japan, but Hot Springs dissociation. The window when I can do things is very small. The auxiliaries it lights up, drink, bet, and brawl. Lilac, amber, lapis lazuli light up their dreams. I look for another century, they game and steam. Gemma Robinson and others for the Out of Bounds poetry project, they sent me very kindly to recite some poetry and do some responses to the Roman bath ruins, which are at the Bear's Den near to Glasgow, or in Glasgow, depending on your point of view. And the Out of Bounds project's got some extraordinary resources for schools, as well as digital poetry maps by Black and Asian poets responding to place in Britain, not in I don't have any mangoes way, but in somewhat more creatively motivated ways. This again is a collage poem. There's someone in the audience who knows where it's from. Accusation, affirmation, woof, woof, woof. Believing that dogs will go to heaven. There will be dogs in heaven. Wanting all the dogs in heaven. There will be dogs in heaven. Not leaving enough dogs for other people in heaven. There will be dogs in heaven. There are some much longer and more serious poems, but quite a lot of this book is about being small. There's some more fragmentary poems. As lots of people will know, I had a terrible physical and somewhat mental breakdown in 2021, from which I'm more or less recovered. But one of the things that I did was start to apply a kind of pointilliste technique of catching and putting together images, glimpses, flickerings, etc. And a lot of this is to do with the poetics of smallness. And as a Dominican friar pointed out to me, it's not a self-denigrating smallness, but a smallness like Mother Julian's hazelnut. That's the mandatory Norwich reference in all my work. Do Google if you don't know it, otherwise you could ask Jeremy Noel Todd if he's here. Small thing at play. This is me going around Launceston with my notebook, remember the capital city in Cornwall where you can stay at Cypress Well, and I was feeling like a very small creature, not even like a person, and having extraordinary sort of sensory reactions to the environment. And very often I wanted to pat or lick or run around. I mean, I obviously wouldn't actually do this as a grown-up human being. I didn't particularly want to photograph, anatomize, annotate. Small thing at play. It exists. Daffodils are higher than my toes. Dandelions higher than my nose. Yet I am not buried. What am I? Very small. On an hill. It seeks. Source of song, snug and bite, boing and flink, flump and fight. Is there one pool where you are all that swims, that blinks, that hunts, that calls? It hides. Human offering wildflowers in egg cups to look at. Been stopped while alive, small thing. Has eaten, yellow off walls, licked the stone, likes to remain buttery, uncollected. This one was commissioned by the Royal Society of Literature. It's a Windrush poem. It's always a great pleasure to work with them. Turn and live. The sacrifice got up off the altar. Become an archaeologist of your lungs. Windrush is the name of a ship, not of a generation. Windrush is the name of a ship, not of any situation. Windrush is the witchcraft name of a ship water-lining us into uncharted, obligatory, and perpetual migration. The sacrifice got up off the altar. Become an archaeologist of your lungs. The naming of ships is a terrible thing. The terrible mother tell me. I came in a ship called Threat Vector. I came in a ship called Dust to Dust. Who came in a ship called Willing Ambassador? Who came in a ship called Evidence of Funds? Did I dance with you on the blue carpet? Was your ship called the Providence? The Invitation? Was your ship called Guerrilla Diplomacy? Go back where you came from, citizens, says terrible motherland. Whether that means overseas or going back under the sea, citizens, life forms. Listen to the lady. She is a consultant anonymizer, a high mobility native of Fortress Trolley. We are phantasmagorically, primarily and politically lightless and all-bearing creatures, put down, not undrowned, gone beyond, beyond drowned. The sacrifice got up off the altar. Become an archaeologist of your lungs. A woman is sweeping the sea. In the father's words, in Kamau's words, a woman is sweeping the sea. They still say in English, a ship is a she. Who say so? The ship is a thing of itness, witness and creator, fury of a wake, raking over of witness. The island scholar is sweeping the carpet in her London digs, sweeping the sea grey, the pea souper carpet, in no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, London's aspirational digs. That carpet had etiquette. It demanded her to accept it in its misty itness as grey, grey like ethical practice, dove or pigeon grey. Could the island scholar trust loose talking fibre after she studied the French liberator? Charles de Gaulle, who dismissed our archipelago as specks of dust? She sweeps and a pattern emerges, stabilizing as many colors, stabilizing as a miracle, a many-colored pattern wanting to dance beside her feet, after she was forced to breathe in dust, settling and unsettling the miracle of many colors. The sacrifice got up off the altar. Become an archaeologist of your lungs. The island scholar is my mother, by the way, who's here, and she can answer questions about the carpet. I'm going to pass every question on in this way. It's a really good audience for that.
Well, yes. I suppose first of all, thank you. That was, I mean, another layer being added to these poems. I mean, we engage so often with poems as pieces of, black and white marks on paper, and having them embodied in that way was, yeah, I mean, striking. And there were different things that transformed, things that where the words stood against how I'd read them originally, and then again made me kind of think about them in different ways. And I will, I think, as soon as my children are asleep this evening, go back and kind of try to fall over again in proper directions. I just yeah, I had a couple of sort of more general questions. I would sort of I mean, I noticed you mentioned obviously this very famous modernist line, the wet black bough in one of the poems, and then also repeated at various points in some of the earlier poems, there's kind of please come flying, which is a phrase that I remember first of all from the Elizabeth Bishop poem, The Invitation to Miss Marianne Moore, where she's inviting her to come, and you scrunch it, which is really, it makes it look very exciting as well. It's please come flying, all one word, and so on. And then obviously Dante and that bit of Kipling I picked up and so on. And I'm just wondering, and then so I mean, I suppose sort of uh broadly, kind of, does poetry have to live alongside and know that it lives alongside the words of others? I mean, I suppose it's a sort of broad question about tradition and quotation and so on. And then I was also thinking, in the title of Accusation Affirmation, woof, 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 maybe you were quoting a specific dog. Um, so I don't know how
I
you,
am more than
yes, how you want to talk about that.
I'd like to talk about the dog.
Please, yes, I'd like to hear about the dog.
Thank you. Well, there have been a number of the dogs of others, as I call them, in my life. Unfortunately, I've not had a dog of my own. And this particular dog is Otto, the Hungarian Vizsla, who belongs to Tiffany Atkinson, who is in the audience, who earned his reputation as a hound of the Lord in two ways, because this is a perfectly true story, and this is the kind of thing I can't put into poems. I would have to be a Latin American short fiction writer. And we went into Norwich Cathedral with him, where there was the cast of a gigantic dinosaur skeleton on display. And I wrote about this for the UEA Contemporary Poetry Archives project. It's in a pamphlet alongside the much better Joelle Taylor, Gail McConnell, and J. Bernard. I strongly recommend that you seek it out. But I thought you wouldn't be able to tell what it was just because it was too big. Do you know? It really was
Mhm.
enormous. But he took one look at it, and if I've ever seen a dog blanch, auto blanched, and he clearly registered it was a dragon. He looked from its nose to the tip of its tail, then he looked uncertainly at all the people around it, concluded they were stupid, and drew himself up very proudly and pressed himself close to Tiffany and me and began to strut around, giving it dirty looks. He was going to guard us against the dragon, which for me does prove that dragons and humans and dogs must have overlapped at some point in time. Otherwise, how could he have known to do that? It couldn't just have been, practice from giant chickens or something. And the other thing that Otto did in that visit was all by himself fold himself up in a kneeling posture at a very clean little altar to Christ crucified. I say little very clean because, I mean, there was nothing to attract a dog to it. I wasn't there, Tiffany wasn't there, there were no food stains on it. And he simply stayed in a posture of adoration, and people started whispering and pointing that he was a holy dog. And I talked about this to the Dominican friars at Blackfriars, Cambridge afterwards, laughing and saying, oh, they said he was a holy dog. And they said, well, he was. He was showing that animals have an intuition of the sacred, and he disproves Aristotle, and began arguing amongst themselves as to how this was the case. So
That's
that's the dog that's quoted in the woof, woof, woof. It's quite clearly that dog has earned his place in heaven. He was willing to lay his life down for Tiffany and me. And also he fell into adoration and prompted.
that's a wonderful story, and I'm glad that I asked what seemed on the surface a slightly kind of light question, but the light questions have the best answers.
Sorry, I
Uh,
mean, it was a really extraordinary dinosaur skeleton cast. I really hope they do something like that again.
yeah. The other thing, I mean, there were a couple of things that I mean, sort of thinking, I mean, asking questions in a slightly oblique way, I think. It's like I said in the introduction, sort of reading this and everything started to become kind of seen in the same through this sort of slightly skewed or sort of different viewpoint. And I was reading actually very, I mean, sort of very different in lots of ways, but I,
Sorry, James, your signal is wavering a little. Or mine is.
a poetry and poetry. He has Horace king the "Es sorprendente el fet d'una cirera." The fact of a cherry is surprising, which I just thought, oh, I've disappeared.
No, we can hear you, but you've simply frozen.
Hello?
Ça va mieux, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you and I can see you, and I
Won
believe.
Wonderful. That is, I mean, that's an advantage for something. Maybe not for everybody, but for me certainly. So
Can you
how far did I
continue
get
speak?
before I...
Not very far. I think that it fainted when you began to speak in tongues.
Ah, okay. Uh, so yes, I mean the question was, I mean there's this line that's been going through my head. So the fact of a cherry is surprising, which seemed to me in some ways a very kind of Capildeo-esque line. I was just wondering, I mean, you addressed it with this idea about touching, licking this lickable space that you're in. I'm just wondering about kind of engaging with senses beyond the sort of normal ones of the normal ones of poetry of seeing things and so on. I mean, smell, touch, taste all seem to be very significant as well, and the physical kind of falling over, the occupation of space.
I'm really very good at falling over, but that's interesting that you raised that question because the person who could answer it is Maya Kaspari, who I think is in the audience. We were in Peru together presenting at the Universidad Pontificia of Lima on the poetics of touch, or rather on poetry and slash as touch, which I don't want to do that horrible senior researcher thing of jumping all over and describing, because it's actually Maya's core research rather than my own, and I'm incredibly lucky to be working at York alongside her and benefiting a little bit from the fringes of it. But certainly one of the things that, to me, Maya's work seems to be doing is putting together almost a new anthology of poems that can show us ways into reconsidering the connections between the senses and also thereby deriving new theoretical approaches for understanding the relationship of language to experience. Personally, I mean, my much less sort of sophisticated take would be, oh, here's a poem by Dion Brand in which such and such happens. And can you notice that, for example, when there's the gurgling in the throat, that gurgling isn't simply a word that invites us to imagine a sound, but also a wetness, also an interiority, and a muscular motion. So to read a word like gurgling purely as a visual form or as onomatopoeic, whatever that might mean, is terribly misleading, especially in the context of that particular poem, which is very much about touch, skin, pulse, blood, and history. Oh,
Yeah.
what's in the...
Oh, in the chat, well, Ian Duiggs found the whole of the Vicente Andrés Esteles poem, which
Oh,
I
wonderful.
it is
I was
lovely to
terrified for a moment it was Maya giving away her bibliography, which,
ah
no, good.
not yet. Don't do it. Don't do it, Maya.
No, otherwise I'll have to duel you all behind the cathedral at 6.
Ah, yes. No, the other thing um no, the other thing I wanted to mention again was I think analogies. I mean, like I say, sort of seeing things in different ways. Um, it's we're staying we're here in Girona for a friend who's getting married, and we're staying in a little hotel next to the church, and the church tower is wonderful. I mean, you've just missed it ringing the quarter, but it rings at the quarter. It rings one bell at the half past. It rings two bells quarter to, three bells, and it rings four bells, and then it rings the number of hours, but it rings it twice. So there's this sudden sort of explosion of sound. So 11:15, one bell, 11:32, 11:45 to midnight, kind of 28 bells that last for a long time. And I was just wondering, I mean, again, I suppose it's sort of starting to see everything through the eyes that I've picked up from this book. But again, that idea of um expectation and then kind of transformation and excess and kind of joyous excess. Is that something that you see in the way you write? I mean, again, it's obviously kind of quite a complicated question, and I mean, there's all those Larkin's lines about kind of not really liking being asked about how you write poetry, but it just seems this idea of kind of joy and displaying joy is something that's very important. I was just wondering if that's true.
I'm never more overjoyed than when compared to Philip Larkin, James. Never.
Mm.
No, it's absolutely true. And when I began at the University of York back in 2020, I had said to Helen Smith, who was then head of department, that I wanted to work on silence, crisis, and excess. For me, silence in the positive senses, and that's a project I really want to pick back up properly next year. But crisis, of course, we've been having crises. But excess, yeah, yes, excess in terms of the superabundance of joy. Yeah, I was with a very creepy person in an enclosed space. Sorry, this is probably a wildly triggering story. Anyway, please, lots of what I say is going to be terrible for the next few minutes. In many ways, including violence, not in the stories, but in other ones. And I remember he was coming on to me quite hard, but in a very weird way. My mother knows all about this. And I snapped at him that I didn't want anybody but God, which I'm not sure if it's true or not, but he'd picked me up at the church and started to harass me. And when I said that, I didn't say it angrily or confrontationally. I said it extremely joyfully, because all my memories of being in that place were of things like patting cats or generally people being nice and good. And so there was a way in which tapping into an absolute lived and remembered shared experience of joy utterly silenced and cleared away his attempt at aggression. Does that make any sense? He wasn't at
Yeah.
all convinced. He wasn't convinced by the content of my choice. He was convinced by the affect of my communicating it.
Yes. I mean, in some ways, kind of people who are not, who don't follow the content are entirely convinced by Dante, as you say. I mean, Dante is a very significant poet for so many poets, including those who, yes, don't follow him for the content of what he's saying, but for the organization, the way, yes, I mean, the excess in some ways. I think so. It sort of feeds back neatly to some of the things that you were saying before. There's one question currently in the Q&A box, which is in good academic tradition, not a question, more of a statement. But it's from the wonderful Michael Schmidt. I'm astonished at how literally you see through language. That's my question. I don't know where you want to take that or how you want to take it. I think it's a good observation.
I'm worried that it means I'm a literal and not a conceptual thinker. I'm also amused because of the double sense, at least, of see through, the way in which one can see through, as it were, a veil of language to something else, or the way in which you can see through language in which you're not taken by it, or in the way in which you can see through language. So language becomes the medium for perception. So rather than language being a medium of expression, that it is in the languaging that one perceives. There's so many meanings in that one statement. That's very typical of our jefe.
Hmm. Yes. No, I think I think that's true. I mean, the way, I mean, I think the way that language always is something that is there to be, I mean, coming back to excess and joy, there to be enjoyed and there to be, I mean, in some ways, some poets find it rather inconvenient that, that language does have all these extra bits to it that you can't kind of pin it down. I mean, the very sort of um, we've had Larkin, the very sort of straight down the line T.S. Eliot view of kind of pinning language and this moping about the fact that words slip and slide and won't stay still and so on. But I think one of the things that is extremely enjoyable is the way that you take that into what you write. That the I mean that poems can kind of lead you, and a gaze can become a glaze, and failing can become a falling, as we have in Black Ice and so on.
You
And then
think you should ask Ian Dewey about the puns in that word, really. You need a Northern Irish accent in your mind to get that particular set of puns. Sorry, go on.
no, but I was just sort of wondering about that as the way in. I mean, again, a way in. I mean, I mean, like I say, these all sort of feel very intimate questions, but kind of the way in which you think, the things you notice about language. I mean, do you notice that you notice them, or is it just sort of things that occur as you're writing?
I think when I write, I go into a sort of hyper mode, and I can't. My brain is working properly then, which means I can't articulate it humanly because human articulation is too slow. It's a bit like
Mhm.
when I was doing pure maths, and this is why I can't. When I go back out of the poem, I can't explicate it much more than I could explicate pure maths. So, which I could, of course, you can do in a skeletal way, but not the actual thing that happens. In terms of success and joy, I think that's also something I learned very much from other people who have extreme experiences or have lived in extreme situations. So Victoria Guerrero Perano, who's a Peruvian poet whom Maya Kaspari suggested we meet over in Lima. She writes about the most appalling things, such as the forced sterilization of people with uteruses. But she does that in a poem on ligatures, and she uses many senses of ligature and tying. The way she does that reminds me of the amazing way that Gail McConnell uses typography to address the questions of memory, reportage, and assassination. And in her interviews, she's very clear that she writes from joy, that she writes out of joy, that joy moves her. She doesn't say that it's almost the inverse of what makes me furious among the people I used to know in my younger life, who would always swear that they wrote out of a wound, and then they would basically just write about fancying people and getting drunk, with a little bit of reading the newspapers thrown in. And yet they were writing out of the deepest anguish. They couldn't write without suffering. Here's Victoria actually in a place of the most terrible violence, whether you're taking it back to well-intentioned human sacrifice or to the conquistadores or any of the more recent violences or the intimate violences she writes about, and yet she's writing beautiful language and she's moved by joy. Also, when Father Gabriel Romanelli, the parish priest from Raza in the Holy Land, was over in Glasgow giving an ecumenical talk, I didn't know when I walked into the room a bit late who he was, but he was smiling and laughing, and there were other panelists there who were looking terribly serious. And then I realized it had to be him, the one who was smiling and laughing, because he had the strength of buoyancy, if that makes sense. And somebody asked him why, or how can he be like that? And he said that his parish was praying for us because they were dying under the rubble, they themselves, but in good faith and helping each other regardless of ethnicity or religion. But that when they looked out at us, they were seeing souls under the rubble, one way or another, joyless or fragmented, or unable to be humanly empathetic.
Yeah.
But what really struck me was the incredible steadfastness of his joy. It was like a well-built ship on a difficult sea, not bouncy but buoyant.
Yeah. I think, although there's, I mean, a couple more questions in the Q&A, I think that might be a place where we can stop. I mean, this steadfastness of joy, I think, is a um firm and surprising place to pause. And this is a a firm and surprising collection, and I'm very pleased and grateful to have had the chance to think about it and talk about it here. And I'm particularly grateful to you, and of course, thank you to Carcanet and everybody for organizing this.